Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, to the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined by Master Sanders. It's been a while, Master Sanders, but we're here to talk about the current problems the SBC is having and its likely future.
Oh, sorry, just one moment. I got some technical issue. Real quick. There you go. Sorry, I had it playing there. Anyway, so yes, but yeah, we are reason why we're doing this is because I want to talk a little bit about what's going on with the SBC, which I am an SBC congregant now. It's been in the news lately, in large part because of the scandals that have surrounded some of the church leaders, especially with one former president. But before we really get into that, I think there needs to be some historical background, and I'm going to try to make this as quick as possible because there's a lot to cover. But you have to understand a lot of this to understand what's going on in the SBC right now, compared to, let's say, other church structures or denominational structures, what have you. Now, uh, the Baptists as a national organization in the United States really emerged in the era around the War of 1812 and afterward, where you had a strong feeling of national unity across the country. That sparked a number of different nationwide movements and charities. One of the more prominent ones to have continued is probably the American Bible Society. And denominations, as we understand them today as nationwide organizations, really began to emerge during this time as well. And one of them was the Triennial Baptist Convention, as it came to be known. So the Triennial Baptist Convention was basically an alliance of churches across the United States that came together to pull together funds for missions, both foreign and domestic. Okay, so it was never meant to necessarily be a hierarchical structure per se, in the way that other denominations were, but rather it was a pooling of resources to basically leverage those resources to increase their missions potential across the world. And this was in places like India and then later places like Africa and so forth, and China, especially in the late 19th century. Now, uh, by the time of the American Civil War, in the decades leading up to the American Civil War, slavery was becoming a very prominent issue, and it was splitting a lot of national organizations along those lines. So, a lot of the national unity that many of these organizations had were tested by the issue of slavery. And the Southern Baptist Convention experienced a similar split in the 1840s. Now, there were other issues at play. We don't really have time to go into that now, but slavery was the catalyst that brought those issues that were sources of tension between Northern and Southern Baptists. And so in the 1840s, the Southern Baptists officially formed in breaking away from the other Baptists that were in the North. Now, most other denominations like this split in the United States prior to the American Civil War, but after the war, many of them came back together. The Presbyterians did, the Methodists did. The Southern Baptists did not. They did not rejoin with the Northern Baptists, and there's a multitude of reasons for that, but we won't get into that. But the Southern Baptists continued as its own separate organization and has kept its name ever since its formation in the 1840s. Now, the Southern Baptists were never truly a mainline denomination in the same way that many others became, like the Methodists and the Presbyterians and Congregationalists did. But there were certain strains within Southern Baptists, especially in the intellectual class, in places that were in the seminaries, that were more inclined in that direction. So, in the 1960s, you had the publication of a book called "The Message of Genesis" by Ralph Elliott, and Ralph Elliott was a professor at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kansas, and he posited certain things such as um, questioning the historicity of certain passages, especially around Genesis 1 through 11, using what we call today like historical critical methodology. Melchizedek wasn't really a priest of Yahweh, but of Baal, etc. So these kind of things. And that sparked a lot of attention throughout the Southern Baptist Convention, thinking like, oh, wow, this is actually being taught in the seminaries, that is being sponsored by Southern Baptist churches. And so this and a couple of other events sparked what became known as the conservative resurgence. Now, there are two principal players in the conservative resurgence. One is Paige Patterson, who was a pastor and a president of a Baptist school, and the other was Paul Pressler, who was a judge and a former member of the Texas legislature. And what they did was that they coordinated a political campaign as such to retake the Southern Baptist Convention and by extension take over the seminaries and some of the other institutions to guarantee them to have a much more conservative outlook. Now the strategy was this: is that, as I said, they were going to elect a Baptist, say a conservative, to the Baptist presidency every year for about 10 years. The officers in the Southern Baptist Convention are elected by church delegates from individual churches. So again, in theory, the churches pick the leadership in the SBC rather than the other way around. Again, that's important coming up later. And so the theory is that if you can get enough conservatives to show up to the convention meetings, you could elect the president, and then the president would be in a position where he can appoint what's known as the members of the Committee on Committees, which in turn make appointments to other boards and seminaries within the Southern Baptist Convention. And so theoretically, you can, through a very long war of attrition, you could take over the Southern Baptist Convention away from the more mainline, neo-Orthodox, moderate, whatever label you want to call them. And so in 1979, they won their first victory with electing Adrian Rogers to the presidency. And in the mid-'80s, they won a significant victory by electing Charles Stanley, who had the endorsement of Billy Graham. Although Billy Graham was not a Southern Baptist, he was still very influential in Southern Baptist circles. So Charles Stanley was able to win the presidency of the SBC, and that sort of guaranteed the fact that the conservative resurgence couldn't be contained by the moderates. So many of the moderates opted to leave by the end of the 80s. And then by the beginning of the 2000s, the conservatives had effectively consolidated their control over all Baptist institutions within the SBC. So like the seminaries, the mission boards, etc. And this was sort of culminated in what became known as the 2000 Baptist Faith and Message, which affirmed, among many other things, the sufficiency and inerrancy of Scripture. Now, what happened, though, in the fight to take over the convention was that it was an alliance between two groups that later came to be at loggerheads with each other. One of them are now today called traditionalists. They basically they're not Armenian, but they're basically free will. They believe that anybody can be saved. And then you have the Calvinists, which got a special, which they weren't new Calvinists, but they got a special boost with the emergence of the new Calvinists in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. And so once the moderates and the liberals had left the Southern Baptist Convention by the beginning of the 21st century, the traditionalists and the Calvinists soon found themselves fighting each other. And so the Calvinists have gradually taken over most, if not all, of the institutions in the seminaries in the SBC. But with this being propelled by the new Calvinism, you have also a woke element that was part of it from the beginning. And now the Calvinists are fighting each other, but some of those woke elements came into the SBC riding on the coattails of the Calvinists because of the new Calvinism and its nature in the early 21st century. Now, so that's kind of the ideological background. What's happening right now when it comes to the scandals is that back in 2019, I don't remember the exact name of the newspaper, but a newspaper, the Houston Chronicle, that's it. The Houston Chronicle published an expose talking about all these issues of sexual misconduct and abuse done by SBC pastors. And it was quite an extensive list, although I know not everybody, I mean, they didn't get everybody. I know some people that weren't on that list, frankly. But anyway, the point being is that this sparked a greater crisis within the convention that was already racked by division over the issue of Calvinism. And the more woke Calvinistic elements have been able to basically use these women as an opportunity to launch their own takeover of the SBC, which they seem to be well on doing at this rate. There's all sorts of other things going on right now, but the report that was released was probably going to be the death blow, because the report says that the SBC actually knew about a lot of these cases and kept a list of these cases, despite the fact that they had shot down proposals to create databases for these instances of sexual abuse, like a blacklist. Even though they said we couldn't, we actually were. And one of the people that was on that list that they did some investigation into was Johnny Hunt, who at one time was actually president of the SBC. And if I got the chronology right, I actually think the incident that's reported was actually done while he was president of the SBC, if not shortly thereafter. So yeah, it's just a lot of things happening at once, and it's kind of hard to really explain in a succinct way. But at this stage, the SBC is probably in its death throes right now for a variety of reasons, both ideological and moral, and we can get into the details of some of those as we go through.
Right. Yeah. So one of the things that we've said before in other discussions is that modern evangelicalism, with with these parachurch organizations and centralized institutions, of which the SBC is one, has a lot more in common with the Catholic Church of the Middle Ages than anything that we would consider traditionally Protestant. Well, even say classic Reformed Protestant traditions for like Switzerland or Scotland or the Netherlands. These vast, bloated, bureaucratic systems that are just predicated on in an analogous fashion to what was going on in the right leading up to the Reformation Renaissance, where the Catholic Church was demanding more and more tithe money, more and more support for its grandiose projects. We're seeing that now. They're demanding more and more. I mean, one of the crises over the last 4 years that they've been talking about was the decline in donations, which is due to a decline in church attendance. And it's like you just have it all backwards.
Exactly. Now, two things to your point about practically Catholic polity. There's two instances that come to mind. The first is a lawsuit that's been in the federal court system for a while now. You had, again, the details are very complicated, but you had one pastor named Will McCraney who had some issues with people at the North American Mission Board. Okay, so back up. I'm going to be throwing around a few things talking about the SBC, and it's worth kind of explaining real quick. I would say there are a multitude of agencies within the SBC, but there's three big ones that will keep coming up. There's the North American Mission Board, abbreviated NAM. So NAM is like regarding missions in places like the United States and Canada. So sort of like a domestic missions. Then you have the International Mission Board, or IMB, as the name implies. It's missions outside of the United States and Canada. And the third is the Ethics and Religious Liberties Commission, which is sort of like the SBC's mouthpiece on certain political and cultural issues. And that one especially has been a sore point for a long time under the leadership of Russell Moore. But going back to this, Will McCraney had a position with I think it was the Maryland Delaware Convention, which is like the state convention for those two states in the Baptist organization, and he sued the North American Mission Board because he was saying that the North American Mission Board was running a whisper campaign against him to cause him to lose his job, and he had good reason to do so. Now, when he sued, the ERLC on our end partnered with I forgot the name of the group. I think it's Beckett Fund or something like that, against McCraney, because they were saying that, well, McCraney getting the courts involved in SBC polity was basically trying to get the government to wade in on a matter of the church, which that was not the place of the government. Okay, and so what they did was, in their argumentation, including that in their amicus briefs to the Supreme Court, by the way, said that, because this did go that far, they said that SBC polity, the churches effectively answer to the organization. I mean, to the higher up. So basically, the SBC is a hierarchical organization, rather than the other way around, which in theory, at least what it's supposed to be, the SBC hierarchy answers to the churches and not the other way around. But according to the amicus brief, they were saying that these organizations dictate what happens to those underneath them. And frankly, that's in very, outside of being unethical. I mean, it's just not true. The Supreme didn't matter anyway, because the Supreme Court actually sided with McCraney and kicked the case back down to the lower courts. But it shows you that when confronted with this, Russell Moore attempted to blame the Catholics that were writing their own amicus briefs on the issue. But nevertheless, it's clear that many people in the SBC leadership think that they are part of the Catholic Church, their own Catholic Church, in a sense, where they dictate to the lower churches as to what's supposed to be. So there's one issue on that. Actually, I forgot what the other one was. It'll probably come to me later. But the point being is that, there is a certain level of snobbery in the SBC leadership that has come from the centralization of power. And ironically, it's been this effort of trying to create some sort of doctrinal unity that was created out of the conservative resurgence that has led to this idea that, like, well, maybe the people at the top can dictate to the churches as to what they believe or what they don't believe or what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So yeah, the SBC is well on its way to becoming. Oh yeah, I remember the other one. This is also another one on something I'm a little more familiar with. Back in the late 2000s, the Georgia Baptist Convention built a nice office complex. I believe it was in Duluth. For those of you who are not familiar with Georgia geography, Duluth is a very nice. Well, very nice is a strong word, but it's one of the up and coming suburbs of Atlanta. So that area is growing, a lot of money there, what have you. And so they spent a lot of money that was donated by the individual churches to build this very nice office complex. And it's been a white elephant since. And we've had the GBC's had to close all these floors. Like, they can only really use 1 or 2 floors because it's just so expensive to maintain. And they're having a difficult time finding a buyer, even in a very nice neighborhood where the office building is built. If and when they can actually sell it, they're going to have to sell it at a loss. And so, yeah, it's just like these wastes of money and corruption, unfortunately, is showing itself in a lot of these places within the SBC. And I think, yeah, it's not that dissimilar to where the Catholic Church was in the early 16th century.
And then, of course, what's just so ironic and strange about this is looking at the rise of the Baptist movement itself in the 16th and 17th centuries, positioning itself against, of course, the Roman Catholic Church, but it's in its founding in England, the Church of England, which had just these hierarchical structures and institutions, which were guilty of just the same kinds of malfeasance, which they criticized justly in the 17th century, but they've completely walked all of that back. And also, the Baptists initially were a religious denomination of Christianity that defined themselves contradistinction to society. So they were supposed to be a more radical application of what they understood to be New Testament teachings without having to resort to the copping out that the Anglicans and the Catholics were doing, which they've completely walked back on all of that.
Well, exactly. And again, you have to understand that, at least in the context of the SBC, it was not meant to create a denomination per se in the same way that we understand that today. Rather, it was a way of creating sort of a broad alliance to leverage, the power of Baptist churches across, the United States as a means of funding missions. And what happened over time is that it took on this life of its own, where they founded colleges and seminaries. In fact, a lot of people are maybe surprised that places like Brown and what's now called the George Washington University were founded as Baptist schools to train pastors and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, I think what happened is that over time is that what was initially meant as a kind of alliance to help, of theoretically, autonomous and equal churches just became this sort of behemoth that it is now, and to the point where the leadership thinks that they control the SBC churches. Now, the thing is, though, and this is a positive thing to come out of this. Let's say if an SBC church were to leave the SBC cannot punish them in the same way that a lot of other denominational structures do. So you've seen this a lot with, like, Episcopalians or Presbyterians when you have an individual congregation wanting to leave because of issues related to doctrine or whatever. It's not unusual for the main organization to make it as difficult as possible, and even in the rare cases, just sell the church building out from under the congregation. That's happened in some of these rare cases. But so theoretically, Baptist polity holds enough that Baptist churches can leave. But the problem is, but even so, the SBC considers itself to be this very super important organization to American, culture and politics and whatever, that the ethics of Baptists, especially Baptist leaders, is about protecting the organization rather than the mission. And we can get into some details on that going on. But yeah, the Baptists have become the very thing they used to oppose.
Well, and I think this is where we get a key distinction between where Christians usually go wrong. Is Christianity an institution that you are loyal to, Or is it, or are you loyal to Christ and his teachings? Because the two are not the same and usually diverge starkly over time.
Exactly, exactly. And again, that's a major problem again with any institution. Now, years ago, I read Chuck Colson's book Born Again, and there's this one moment in the book that stuck out at me is when he said he and a couple of other White House staffers were watching the news concerning what happened at Kent State. This is, of course, during the Nixon administration. So, what would happen at Kent State with the student protests? And he said he had this sort of realization at that point that this was no longer an issue about ideology or patriotism or what have you, is that he and his compatriots had basically become statists. And what he meant by statist is that he meant that we're here for the benefit of the organization, for the state, more so than any ideological imperatives. And that's why that was the fly in the ointment for the conservative resurgence in the first place. Now, the liberals and moderates at the time of the conservative resurgence were not, and I use liberal in a very broad and loose sense. These were not theological liberals, capital L liberals, but they were liberal in that they weren't conservative. That's probably a better way of putting it. But even so, they were of a doctrine that wasn't radically liberal. In fact, many of these were neo-orthodox. And people like Karl Barth and others who had formulated neo-orthodoxy were actually reacting to liberalism or theological liberalism and modernism in a way. But nevertheless, I would still consider neo-orthodox to be deviant from what Christianity and the Bible actually teaches. But that being said, it was a concern and it was a problem. But what I find to be rather telling is that the people who spearheaded the conservative resurgence didn't seem to think that, like, well, maybe the problem is the institution itself. Because the seminaries in the Southern Baptist Convention were not the only liberal seminaries in the country. I mean, plenty of them, most of them were theologically, lowercase liberal in one form or another, outside of a few exceptions. So or that maybe the structure itself was what made these kind of theological drifts possible. But instead, it became about like, well, the solution is we need to take over the institution. We need to coordinate efforts to take over the institution. And basically, it was a very long, dragged out fight that resulted in about 1,900 churches leaving the convention over time, and resulted in a lot of acrimony and bad feelings. And it resembled more of a power ploy, more so than anything like a crusade for what was right. In retrospect, and what's happened in a sense is that since now the conservatives are at the head of the convention now, all the problems that have been happening is going to be laid at their feet. They can't blame these on the liberals, and they can't even quite blame these on the up and coming woke crowd either, because a lot of these problems, especially with what the newspapers are reporting, go back about maybe 20, 30 years. And this is when like the conservative resurgency had been cemented. So they can't blame this on theological deviance. This was under their care. And so, but the incentive to hide those things has been more so about preserving the integrity of the convention, or at least the viability of the convention, rather than what was true. So over time, the concerns about protecting the institution overtook anything that had to deal with what was right or theologically correct. And so the fly in the ointment for this conservative resurgence was that it was all about the power and not about about the theological problems that existed. By the way, one more thing on that point. There was a joke going around a lot of SBC pastors during the 80s that was like, well, when the split was being talked about, the joke was among the pastors like, well, I'll go with the side that has the annuity board. And I think that tells you a lot about what the issues were at play during that time.
Well, the other issue too is, problems the conservative resurgency can't avoid is when the talks about church member participation being way down, where starting, a few years back, that was again under downstream of decades of their control over the SBC in the first place. And so it can't be the liberals' fault that people aren't showing up to church because they've been out of power for 40 years now. And it can't be the wokesters because they were just starting to take over, starting to make their presence felt. And so they were already presiding over the uh, exodus of the pews. That once it hit their pocketbook, they finally noticed, oh wait, people are leaving the pews. But who can they blame for that but themselves?
Well, exactly. But even I don't necessarily think that's a bad issue per se, unless it's about the preservation of the organization. Now, it's about 2010 that alarm bells start to go off in the SBC leadership. Is that like, oh, baptisms are down, church membership is going down. So we need to rectify this. Now, again, this goes back to the preservation of the institution, because more church members and active church members means more tithes. More tithes means, going into not just the pockets of the churches, but of the major organization of itself. The drive for the next 10 years, especially, has been about evangelism, which evangelism is not, I mean, it's not necessarily bad, but I've I've become more dubious as to what the purpose of this was. It was not so much to get people in a right relationship with God, so much as it was to fill the pews and to get people in pews. And that's why church planning became this, big thing, where North American Mission Board sponsored countless different church plant attempts, usually under some kind of new Calvinist milieu, but still, all these church plants that in some ways were even undermining the established Baptist churches. But the idea is that these church plants would hopefully again get the cool people into the Baptist church to give their money. Now, this is also another thing that is part and parcel with this as well, because the Southern Baptist Convention was formed uh, in part out of the conflict over slavery and the fact that Southern is still in the name. This has been a source of embarrassment for many in the leadership, not so much of the conservative resurgence generation, but in their children or the second generations, what have you, that are very concerned about having the word Southern in the name as being a detriment to their ability to outreach and to shed this idea that they're just a bunch of old conservative white men. And so they've done these kind of like there was actually a look into changing the name of the Southern Baptist Convention, but the committee ultimately came up with a kind of pathetic, weak sauce name. I think it was called Great Commission Baptist or something like that, and they eventually dropped it. But their whole obsession, but in other cases, you've had a lot of churches, including J.D. Greer's own church, the Summit, have even dropped the name Baptist entirely because of the PR connotations. But you see and many people have actually joined SBC churches and they didn't know they were SBC churches. And they would not have joined these churches if they were SBC churches. Okay. So the whole, hand wringing about, declining baptisms and about our PR image, things like that. These were not really stemmed with concerns about reaching lost, in my opinion, and based on everything that they've done, is that this was really based on their fear that they were going to be considered, too conservative, too culturally irrelevant. But with that meaning fewer and fewer dollars coming into the treasure, into the offering plates, and they won't be able to basically have their gravy train that many of these men in the SBC leadership have enjoyed.
Now, I remember when this was breaking a couple of years ago, when more conservative types like Tom Askell were trying to prevent Ed Litton from getting in and fighting the other wokesters, which led to all sorts of acrimony. And why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Okay. So the woke crowd, and this gets a lot of Calvinists angry when I brought this up, but the woke crowd piggybacked in many ways off of the new Calvinism. And the new Calvinism was a very broad tent to begin with, and at one time actually comfortably fit some theonomists like Doug Wilson at one time. But right now the new Calvinist coalition has fallen apart for a number of reasons, and a lot of people that were once chummy are no longer so. It's actually kind of amusing. I think you can go online and you can find with TGC, there's a panel discussion with Vadi Balcom, Russell Moore, and JD Greer, and I don't think any of them would ever share a stage today in the same way they did then. But going back to that, yeah, the woke phenomenon in the church, a lot of them were riding off of the new Calvinists. because the New Calvinist Church was a rather broad church in that sense. That being said, with the New Calvinists, is that they actually won for the first time the SBC presidency with J.D. Greer. J.D. Greer, I think, was the first one who openly describes himself as Reformed, right? Compared to previous presidents, but I'm not sure that they even claim J.D. Greer anymore. But J.D. Greer is self-described Reformed. But with okay, but this is actually what's very interesting. Al Mohler, who was one of the young guns in the conservative resurgence, was in many ways viewed as going to be the next president of the SBC for a while. A lot of people in different organizations in the SBC and the seminaries had some connection one way or another to Southern Seminary. Now, Al Mohler is the president of Southern Seminary. He took over Southern Seminary in the 90s, and he basically dragged it into a more conservative direction. There was a lot of acrimony, basically tore down what Southern was and rebuilt it in this kind of like New Calvinist friendly environment. And a lot of presidents in different aspects of the Southern Baptist Convention, the seminary presidents have one connection or another to Southern. They were either one of his students or they were in his staff or what have you. So it looked like it was going to be inevitable that he was going to be elected president. But the problem is that because he had a rather broad church of Calvinists, including some woke Calvinists, he had isolated many members of the right because of his refusal to get rid of the more woke members of Southern Seminary. And then when he realized this was going to be a liability for him, he strong-armed the other Southern Seminary presidents into signing a statement condemning critical race theory. And what that ended up doing is that it isolated the left. And so when it came to the convention last year, the inevitable, it was going to be a coronation, I think, but the inevitable election of Mohler was just an absolute failure, and it resulted him in getting into third place. So he wasn't even available for the runoff. Litton, I'll be honest with you, I never heard of Ed Litton prior to last year's convention. But Litton represented the more like woke friendly aspect of the convention. And Litton has been in national news for basically plagiarizing his sermons. And when it came out that a lot of his sermons were plagiarized from J.D. Greer, and then we found out that J.D. Greer bought a lot of his sermons from Docent, which is an organization that does demo research and basically sermon prep for pastors who are just, I guess, too busy to write their own sermons. Basically modern day simony. So that just showed a lot of other problems within the convention that, there were a lot of these pastors that buy sermons and steal from each other. And we're actually being led by a rather, vacuous group that resembles more of a fraternity, a college fraternity, than it does a brotherhood of believers. And that kind of good old boy system is very prevalent in the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, Litton is not running for another term. He probably for the best for him. And the leading conservative candidate is Tom Askell, who is the head of the Founders Ministry, which was an early organization pushing for Calvinism in the Southern Baptist Convention. Askell has reached an age where I don't think he can be an effective leader. If you've seen some of his interviews with other groups, it's clear that Askell is getting on in years. But I don't know who the other candidate is. I'm ashamed to say I don't know what the woke candidate's going to be. But whoever it is, like this fight against the woke elements of in the Southern Baptist Convention, I think has already failed, or not so much failed, although I will say that, but it's become meaningless because even if Tom Askell is elected president at the upcoming seminary, it's just too late now. Like the Southern Baptist Convention is going to become the Boy Scouts, and we're going to be paying off all these people that we that are suing the convention. So yeah, I think it's more like, even if they do end up winning, even if Tom Askell and there is somewhat of a mini conservative resurgence and beats back the woke elements of the convention, I think it's too late. They're just going to be fighting over the bones at this point of what used to be the SBC.
Yeah, exactly. There was this great moment where I remember with the Ed Litton crisis, Ron Martin was being interviewed by a bunch of, I think he helped co-found PayPal with Peter Thiel. It was either PayPal or some social media outlet. And he's a Southern Baptist convention guy. And I think he was being interviewed by Tom Askell, and he was being asked what many people have been asking: at what point is it worth getting out of the SBC? And he gave this really mealy mouth, ass covering answer that, well, only if there's nobody left in it, paying for these funds that are going to be fighting against the woke people. Well, that's not an answer to the question, because you're saying it's only worth not fighting for once it's not worth fighting for anymore. That's not what people are asking. They're asking, at what point do we call that and pull the trigger to get out? And of course, it was very clear that he was just trying to defend the money stream, because there was no point at which you would pull the trigger and get out. And it's like, well, so you just want people to throw good money after bad in perpetuity? That's ridiculous. And people aren't going to do that, especially as it turns out that the people that do have the money are entering retirement and are going to be on a fixed income. So, that's just par for the course.
Exactly. And that's part of my frustration with the whole the whole argument here, is that nobody in this whole situation, right or left, okay, I wouldn't say nobody, but maybe I'm talking more about the milieu that I'm more familiar with, those on the right, is that nobody's really thinking that maybe the battle was lost a long time ago. Maybe it's not even worth trying to save the SBC. I think that the problems within the SBC are more than just theological. And I think that it's a temptation to just, reduce it to a theological problem. We'll just do the same thing like we did back in the 70s and 80s, and we can, take over the convention again, and we can fix all the problems. Well, the problem is that it's not so much really the theology of the people running the convention, it's the structure of the convention itself. And I don't really think it's in a position that it can be fixed. Now, the situation I referred to with Johnny Hunt is that Johnny Hunt is accused of, allegedly assaulting the wife of another pastor. And this was set up in a rather convoluted way. And you can read the Guidepost report on that. And his story has changed over time too. I think just today he was let go from his position at the church that he was once pastor of. As he's no longer pastor. Well, he's suspended, not fired, but suspended as pastor emeritus. Whatever. And I was reading an article, I think it was last week or the week before, from Protestia. And it was basically, I thought this was typical J.D. Hall clickbaitery, but it was more like, again, I don't remember the name of the article, but basically he was saying was like, why wasn't the pastor whose wife was assaulted by Johnny Hunt, why is he still in the ministry? Why hasn't he been fired for whatever? Because basically what happened is that his wife was assaulted by this other man, and he didn't really do anything about it. He didn't take it to the police or anything like that. Why didn't he do anything about it? Now, I thought that this is a way of asking the question to say like, well, this didn't really happen. But I began to think about it like, yeah, why didn't he? Why, if a similar situation happened to, I hope anybody's, spouse, I hope that you'd be wanting to clear this up. So what I think, but to answer that question, I think it's a very simple answer. It's because that would hurt this pastor's position in the SBC if he were to make waves. I think so. There is a joke that the 11th commandment is thou shalt not speak ill of another Southern Baptist. And what this is a way of kind of closing ranks within the SBC and the leadership, is that you don't dare criticize the leadership publicly like this, or you don't undermine these people, because what that does, unless it's an acceptable target and this person is no longer in the leadership clique, like say Paige Patterson. And the reason why you don't do that is because, of course that makes the body of Christ look divided, but that could result in you losing positions. That can result in you losing certain connections. That's what happened to Will McRaney when he took his suit against NAM basically to the Supreme Court. But yeah, it's this kind of like, good old boys club is really rampant in the Southern Baptist Convention. And it's not exclusive to the Southern Baptist Convention, but the the way the structure is very conducive to that. One more thing, and this actually does relate to Johnny Hunt. And I remember reading this or hearing about this in, I don't remember if it was if it was a Baptist news outlet or not, but it was at this retreat for pastors in Georgia, and Johnny Hunt being big in Georgia Baptist circles because he was at First Baptist Woodstock, which is outside of Atlanta. He was there, and there was this weird moment in the retreat that this Baptist news source reported, was that there was this one pastor who stood up publicly and apologized publicly to Johnny Hunt for criticizing First Baptist Woodstock for their perceived failure to do something in a particular, for not spending enough money on missions. So apparently he had criticized the church for not spending enough on missions. And he said, because I made this, I didn't know that the First Baptist had spent thousands of dollars on missions. And so because I criticized the church publicly, I need to apologize publicly. Okay. This kind of weird, like Stalinist show trial apology. Is what struck me as weird. Well, and I think probably his criticism was likely correct, because even if the church only spends thousands of dollars on missions, it was probably only a fraction of the budget. And we know God cares more about percentages than he cares about dollar amount. But the point being is that, like, if you want to be anywhere in these organizations, like, you better toe the line, keep your mouth shut. And you don't dare criticize the leadership, or otherwise, you're going to be, stomped out or going to be cut off or whatever. And so, yeah, the Southern Baptists in many ways, it's just another way in which the Southern Baptist Convention acts like the Catholic Church.
Well, and what I find with this particular problem and other problems that have been affecting Protestant churches is, since the Protestant Reformation and all the churches that have been born out of it were born out of the awareness that you couldn't save the institution called the Catholic Church. You had to leave. Everybody, all the churches that have this problem, whether it's Lutheran churches or Southern Baptist churches or Reformed churches, they've completely flipped. It's like it would never enter into their mind to leave the institution. They're going to try to fix it, which is literally anathema to where they all started. It's just mind-boggling.
It is. And there has been an organization that has emerged called the Conservative Baptist Network that's dedicated to sort of coordinating conservative efforts against the wokening of the convention. And I'm just at a point, like, again, who cares? Like, do you really want to be in the driver's seat when this all implodes? And it is well onto its way of imploding. And it's the reasons for this are rather, complex. Part of it is nostalgia. Part of it is like a lot of their life is tied up in the SBC, that they hate to see it go, or others are maybe under this idea that maybe if we control the SBC, we could be much more effective as witnesses or whatever. The problem is that what I fear is that even if the conservatives were to win, and let's even say that the SBC survives for another 2 or 3 decades, that it manages to weather this storm, what's going to happen when the next generation causes the same problem? For example, like the people that are in the Conservative Baptist Network, they're made up of traditionalists and Calvinists. Again, it's the same alliance that they had before then. And my thought is like, well, what's going to happen? Let's say, again, best case scenario, Tom Askell gets elected, and then all these other, we have a wave of conservative, appointments and things like that, what have you. Let's say that happens, and what's to stop further infighting from happening down the road when the Calvinists and the traditionalists will once again be at each other's throats? And so my thought is, I'm looking at this situation, it's like we're basically repeating the same thing, and we're hoping for a different result.
Which is another definition for insanity.
Exactly. So, which is, I've reached the point, at least in my life, and there's a number of other things too, which we don't necessarily have time to go into here, but I wouldn't say I'm intimately familiar, but I've been enough on the periphery of SBC life to know that there is a lot of corruption and a lot of good old boy mentality in the leadership, that I think something like this, that a wokening actually is probably inevitable as people react to this sort of thing. One more thing. One of the things that does frustrate me with the right is that because if they see a feminist or an egalitarian or a liberal or whatever attack something, they have this instinct to defend it, right? So what happened, going back to the guidepost issue, is that, the guidepost, report looked pretty bad, and then fairly recently Guidepost has tweeted out like their support for Pride Month or whatever, and so this has given the conservatives the leeway, saying, "See, how can we trust anything coming out of Guidepost?" Or whatever. And so that's been a way for them to sort of once again make an indefensible position by trying to cast doubt on it, and then pretend like none of this is. I don't know. It's the problem is that. The issue is about power. It's not about what's between the legs of the leaders. It's about power. This is not about patriarchy. All the instances of what you see that's happening in the convention, they're all from pastors. It's not from men in general. It's from pastors. It's from these hierarchical structures that make this kind of bad behavior conducive. That's not going to stop the feminists and the egalitarians from making hay of this and try to say, hey, this is patriarchy's fault, right? That's going to happen. But on the other side, I would tell people on the right is like, look, the feminists and the egalitarians would not be in a position to say these things if these people didn't at least pretend to make homage to patriarchy or whatever. If these people weren't behaving badly. So I think, if people like Doug and people like Doug Wilson and people in his organization, which again, he's not SBC, but if people in Doug Wilson and his organization are acting so badly, and he pretends to take this hard line on patriarchy, then yeah, people on the other side are going to jump on that and say, like, yeah, I mean, it's the reason why all these problems are going on at Moscow is because of this mentality of patriarchy that they have, which I don't think it's true. I think there are other issues at play, but still, the bad behavior of people claiming the mantle of the Bible and of traditional morality and traditional family structures, no matter how sincere or they really believe it, but the people who claim that mantle, and when they act badly and they act to cover up sin in these certain areas instead of trying to expose it and deal with it as quickly as possible, that's what gives the opposition the ammunition they need to fire at you. You are handing them boxes, and cartridges and magazines of all this kind of weapons to be used against you. I don't really think some of these people have the right to complain when they are attacked by the feminists and by these other people. So yeah, like the fact is like it's their bad behavior their own bad behavior has discredited them, or the bad behavior of others that claim this mantle have discredited them. And you just need to acknowledge that. That doesn't mean you become a feminist, but you just have to acknowledge that, yeah, people that claim this mantle have acted badly. We don't need to defend these people. But on the other hand, we need to understand that our behavior has the potential to, give the enemy of truth the ammunition they need to undermine your position. So it's just one of my many, many frustrations, if that's not apparent.
Well, the other thing too is in last year, 2021 and 2022, there was a series done by Christianity Today on the rise and fall of Mars Hill. Now, they did make a point at the very beginning that these problems that they're identifying with Mark Driscoll at Mars Hill are prevalent throughout all of these churches, regardless of denomination. They said specifically at the very beginning, this is independent of complementarian or egalitarian churches. Obviously, Bill Hybels was a egalitarian, and he had similar accusations leveled at him, and he had to step down. So clearly, if it's independent of denomination, if it's independent of whether you're complementarian or egalitarian, then clearly it can't be any of those things. It has to be what they share in common. And the only thing they share in common is an organizational structure.
Exactly. And again, there are going to be, people that are going to try to make this out to be an issue of, patriarchy or male leadership. And we've talked a lot about that in the past. It's not, in terms of do these people actually believe that? They don't, but they believe in their patriarchy. They believe in the patriarchy of the pastor and the elders, not of every man in the congregation. So we don't necessarily need to tread over that again. But you're right. It's that these are problems that are prevalent. It doesn't matter if you have this kind of like, semi-progressive egalitarianism, like, Hybels, or this like buff, masculine new Calvinism like Mark Driscoll. The point being is that what they all have in common, as you mentioned, is the fact that they all have these centralized structures. And what's very interesting, again, is that a lot of these structures are based along business models, about growth models. Bill Hybels, again, coming from that same podcast, in his own testimony, was really big about like, well, he basically sacrificed a career in the business world to grow the church, to start, church growth or whatever, which what he did was he didn't really discard his business experience. Rather, he just leveraged his business experience to create Willow Creek Church, which other churches have sought to emulate over the years, regardless of where they are in the theological spectrum within evangelicalism. And that's part of a broader problem, again, is that these structures get to this position because of the flow of money, especially large amounts of money concentrated in the hands of a few people at the top. So again, Paul, in his letter to Timothy in 1 Timothy 6, which is considered one of the pastoral epistles, this is advice for pastors and church leaders. And I think he's talking about specifically church leaders in chapter 6. In terms of when he's talked about some have erred from the faith, he's not talking about the average Christian. He's talking about church leaders, rather. He's saying, the love of money is the root of all evil. And the problems that we have seen in the church, whether it's, Willow Creek or Mars Hill or the Southern Baptist Convention, or the Kirk or Grace Community or Lakewood or what have you, you can name any megachurch you want that's undergoing some of these scandals or whatever. It really just comes back to the love of money that has created these structures that have allowed for tyrannical pastors and lack of accountability, and that the same things that go on in the corporate world. And now we just decided to import the pathologies of the corporate world into the church, which is it's almost as if Paul was right about that.
Yeah, almost. So we're nearing the end of the hour. Is there anything you'd want to leave us with before we wrap this up?
Okay, so the problems of the SBC, and as somebody who's been in SBC culture for a long time, actually my whole life practically, I don't consider myself a member of the Southern Baptist Convention anymore so much as I consider myself an SBC congregant. I'm a member of an SBC church. But even with that distinction, I've become disillusioned with the SBC for some time, right? And for a variety of reasons. But I would say that, in my humble opinion, as much as it's worth, I think the SBC deserves to die. I think it just deserves to collapse under its own weight. I don't think it's worth saving. I don't think conservatives, of any variety, Calvinist or otherwise, should waste their time in trying to revive an organization that's already very sclerotic, already very, troubled and just top heavy. I think we just need to let it die. If only so we can move on and do something productive, hopefully within our own spheres, rather than trying to build these, nationwide or even international economic empires. But my fear is that a lot of my fellow conservatives theologically are not going to don't really see that, and as a result, it's only going to crash and burn. It's going to crash and burn anyway. But what I would hope is that we would just let it crash. But we're just going to have to see what's going to happen over the next few days. I think the SBC will turn into basically the Boy Scouts, where the donation of people's money is going to go to paying off lawsuits and dealing with all these other legal issues, to the point where even the SBC's initial goal, which was to sponsor missions, is going to be lost, because again, it's going to be about defending the organization and trying to manage the decline, so to speak. So I would encourage my fellow conservative Southern Baptists to just leave, just shake the dirt off your feet and just walk out, and maybe we can get something better down the road, preferably in our own churches. But yeah, just basically just let the SBC die.
All right. Well, thank you again, Master Sanders. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fire podcast, signing off.